So in today's web dev tip, we're pretty much ready to push our code to our server for the first time. It's been quite a few days of setup in terms of getting the server ready, but it's pretty much ready to go, and we can go back to our GitHub action finally and put in the commands to actually make the connection to the server and push some of the code. So we've only got the API at the moment, so in this tutorial we're only going to be pushing the API code, but if you remember where we left our GitHub action a few days ago, we were building the Express app as a production bundle, and we were getting this main.js file coming out, and that's what we're going to be essentially building in the GitHub action and then pushing to the DigitalOcean server. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a new step straight after that build step within our pipeline, and we'll give this a name, and we'll say it's going to be set up the SSH agent, and we're going to use another one of these pre-built actions. So Web Factory is the action that I'm using here, and they provide one called SSH agent. And so at version 0.4.1, there might be some newer versions of this. I haven't checked recently, so feel free to have a look and see if there's a newer version of this particular action. But what we're going to be using this SSH agent for is to actually configure our GitHub pipeline environment to find out about the SSH environment on the DigitalOcean droplet and ultimately make an SSH connection. And then we'll be using a tool called rsync, which simply copies the files from one place in our GitHub action up to the server with DigitalOcean. But first we need to make that SSH connection and make sure that it's all good. So one thing we need to provide this with is the SSH private key. And you remember from yesterday, we set up this private key as an environment variable, as a secret within GitHub itself. And this is why we did it, because we don't want to actually put our secret private key inside of our code for someone else to use. So we're going to access the environment variable, the secret that we configured. And to do that within a GitHub action, it's a $, and then two curly braces, both opening and closing. And once you're inside of those curly braces, we can say secrets. And then if you remember, we created one secret yesterday called deploy key, and that was the actual SSH private key. So this is the format that you need to use to access those secrets within your GitHub pipeline code. Okay, so that will set up an SSH library for us that will enable us to actually connect via SSH commands. And then the next thing we're going to do is another step, and we'll create this known hosts setup. And we need to do this because otherwise the GitHub SSH connection won't actually be aware of the DigitalOcean droplet that we're connecting to. And we'll use an SSH Key Scan command to actually scan the deploy host, which is the DigitalOcean server, and make sure that the SSH environment that we're using here is configured correctly. So we just need to have another run command in here, and we run this SSH key scan command. I forget what the -h option means. I'm sure we can find that out from the command line, but we need to make sure that that's here as well. And then we're going to scan the secrets deploy host that we configured yesterday, which will essentially be the domain name of where we're pushing to. And the output of that, we're just going to make sure it gets redirected into the local SSH folder on GitHub, and we'll put that in the known hosts file, and that will just prevent any issues with the SSH configuration complaining that it doesn't know what the server is. Okay, so that is the SSH connection configured and available for us. The last thing we need to do is actually do that final push to actually sync the project files across to the DigitalOcean server. So let's just say we're going to sync the project files. That's the name of this particular step. And what we're going to do is we're going to run the rsync command. So this should be available within our GitHub Ubuntu environment automatically. And we just pass in some flags here. Again, I forget what each of these actually is, but it will basically only copy the files across if they're needed to. So that will just help to reduce the bandwidth of stuff that we're pushing to the server. And we can also pass in this delete flag as well. So what it will do is it will actually remove any existing versions of these files on the remote server. And replace them with the new ones. So what files are we actually pushing up? Well, essentially it's going to be whatever has been generated in this folder, but we want to do it on the GitHub workspace in the action. So there is another variable that we can access here, which funnily enough is called GitHub workspace. And inside of there, we'll have the generated dist folder, very much like we have here. And then inside of there, we'll have apps, and then rickandroll is the name of the project. So once we've selected what files we're actually going to push, what folder we're going to be looking at files to push from, we need to actually make sure that we're pushing it to the right place. And normally what you would do is say it's rickandroll at, and then the IP address, etc., as we have done with our SSH connections before. But again, to keep that information secret, what we're going to do is we're going to use our secrets that we configured yesterday, and we're going to use the deploy user, and then it will be at the secrets .deploy host. And then we also need to make sure that we're pushing it to the right location on the server as well. So I'm going to put that in a particular directory, and again that's specified by secrets remote, make sure I spell it right, remote app path. So just putting it all on one line so you can see that. Again, don't worry too much about copying this out. I'll put a link to a gist or something similar so you can copy and paste this if you need to. But essentially, just to review what we've done, we've created the SSH agent and set that up to use the deploy key and to make sure that it's aware of the DigitalOcean server when it's pushing. And then we're using this rsync command to push all of the generated files from the previous step, which is up here in the build step that we created up here, and then pushing it to the remote folder specified by our secrets. Okay, so all we need to do now is save that and commit it and push it up to trigger a new action. So let's git commit, and it's a new feature, and just say pipeline pushes to server. And then finally, we'll just push that change up to the remote GitHub repository, which should in a few seconds trigger a new action. And hopefully we haven't made any YAML mistakes here, and that should build our project for us and ultimately push it to the remote server. So what you should find when this completes is that you do actually get a failure, and there is one final step on the server that you need to set up in order to enable this to complete. But just to show you what happens if you do get a problem within your pipeline, within the connection phase at least, you should find down here that everything went through okay. We set up our SSH agent, we actually created the known hosts as mentioned, but when we actually came to rsync our files across, again this is the IP address of our DigitalOcean server, we actually got a permissions error, and that's because on the server we need to actually let the server know that we're using GitHub to push our code, and we can make a simple change just to let the server know that GitHub will be pushing our code, and we'll do that in the next tutorial. But for now we've got our action set up and ready to go. It's just that one final step just to actually accept the code at the other end. But that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.